Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Oblong Online on this inauguration day. We apologize for the slightly late start. We had some technical difficulties, the joys and wonders of living in the country. I'm Helen Soslowski of Oblong Books, and this evening we're delighted to welcome someone we always enjoy hosting, New York Times bestselling author, and I hear a big Priscilla Herdman fan, Simon Winchester, with his new book, Land: How the Hunger for Ownership Shaped the Modern World, in which he examines how we acquire land, how we steward it, how and why we fight over it, and finally, how we can, and on occasion do, come to share it. Also joining us this evening from Duchess Land Conservancy, which is a non-profit conservation organization dedicated to preserving the rural character, important resources and open lands in Dutchess County, New York, are Rebecca Thornton and Julie Hart. Rebecca is the Conservancy's president, and Julie is senior manager of stewardship and education. You may type in questions you have for our guests at any time during this presentation by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen, and we will address them at the end of the program. The chat is disabled for the duration of this program, so that's the only place you can enter your questions. Thank you all for joining us to engage in what promises to be a fascinating discussion about land. Rebecca, would you like to kick us off?
Great, thank you, Helen. Thanks for that great introduction. So as Helen mentioned, we work to preserve land, and since our inception, we protected about 43,000 acres. Am I echoing everybody but me? Yeah.
Look in your browser and see if you have more than one window open.
Yeah, Rebecca, we've got no audio on you. I apologize, everyone.
So let's see. It's asking me if I want to close all. So I don't want, Julie, why don't you take it over?
Okay. Yeah. Rebecca, just make sure you only got one browser window open. Delete all the others because otherwise it'll feed back on you.
Okay.
So I'm going to
let Julie talk.
I'm going to disable Rebecca's audio just for the moment. Julie, would you like to take it away, please?
Sure. So Becky's going to give an introduction to the Duchess Land Conservancy, and I'll step up and do my best on that. So we're a nonprofit land conservation organization. We were started 35 years ago, which is pretty old for land trust. But as you will learn from Simon's book, there are land trusts that are quite a lot older than that. So we're based in Millbrook, which is right in the middle of Dutchess County, and we work throughout Dutchess and up into Columbia County as well. And we've protected over 47,000 acres of land, if I'm remembering the number correctly, through conservation easements, working with private landowners. So we work with a lot of local landowners and farmers to protect the land and those ecological systems, keeping them intact on those protected lands. Becky, are you back? Okay, do you want to take over the intro?
Can you hear me? Am I back on speaker?
Yes, that sounds good, and there's no feedback now.
Okay, great. So I think that's great. That's a good enough intro, Julie. I think that I just want to thank Helen and Oblong Books and Simon for being here. We really look forward to our conversation. And rather than talk more about the DLC, I'd really like to talk more about our favorite subject, which is land. And so why don't we start off, Julie, I'm going to ask Julie to ask you, start off with a question to you, Simon.
Thank you. So Simon, I was really excited when you wrote about one of my favorite and interesting stories of the local land and history here in Dutchess County, which is the story of the Oblong. And since it is Oblong Bookstore who is hosting this wonderful event, I wonder if you would like to share that story with everyone.
Golly, I'm not even sure that the technicalities of breaking up the Phillips land grant and the whole organization of sort of post-colonial America, which led to this great strip of land between Connecticut and eastern New York. It's probably far better that you explain the technicalities of that than I do. I know that I have this small tract of land that I have in Wassaic, is either teetering on the edge of or is in the middle of the Oblong. But you know the history of it probably far better than I do. So why don't I throw the question back to you? And I'm in a way, less versed in the technicalities of the early ownership of East America than you are. So this will help your cause as well, because you can tell more people that it's important to join the Land Conservancy. How did the oblong come into being?
Well, I can't claim to be an expert on this or to know the whole story, but it is kind of a fascinating little tidbit of history, shrouded in the mists of hundreds of years ago past. But as I understand it, it was a surveying error. And when these colonies were originally being surveyed, it was agreed that the boundary of New York would be 20 miles from the Hudson River. And so the surveyors from New York set the line in a certain place, and the surveyors from Connecticut set it in a different place. And those places were 2 miles apart. And so there's this almost 2 side of Dutchess County that goes all the way down into Connecticut. And it was this contested area that was kind of claimed by, it's just like kind of like a no man's land for quite some time. And ultimately, I believe it was swapped with Connecticut. So New York got the oblong and Connecticut got that little tract of land. You know how Connecticut is mostly square and has that little part sticking out on the southwest. And so those 2 tracts of land were swapped. And that's how the eastern side of Dutchess became known as the oblong. And so that is where the bookstore got its name. And I'm kind of embarrassed to say that I was a customer of Oblong Bookstore for years and years and years before it ever occurred to me to wonder, what does that even mean, oblong?
Well, far be it for me to promote another book, but Mark Stein's very good book, How the States Got Their Shapes, which is one of the many books that I used when I was doing research for this, is utterly fascinating. And survey errors figure quite a lot in this book, because I became very interested, for instance, in a massive survey error made when they were doing the delineation of the border between the United States and Canada, which, as you'll know, is a wiggly line until it gets over the hump of Lake Superior, and then becomes an absolutely straight longitudinal line all the way over, or latitudinal line rather, all the way over to south of Vancouver. And there is this wonderful error round the Lake of the Woods, which has left a piece of the United States marooned entirely inside Canada. You have to drive north from Duluth, cross, turn a bit left, go into Manitoba, pass through into Canadian customs, go 50 miles north, then turn hard right along a gravel road, leading to apparently nowhere. And then you come to another border with the United States. And there's no customs officer there, but there is a hut with a video camera in it. And you have to pick up the telephone, and it automatically dials the immigration service in Washington, D.C. You've got to show them your passport, and then they allow you in. I mean, they can't stop you coming in, obviously, because there's no fence. And you get to this town called Angle Inlet, I think. And it's got a population of about 150 people, monstrously inconvenient, and all to do with the kind of error, a much bigger error than a 2-mile slice of Connecticut and New York. This is a 150-mile error made by some nameless Victorian surveyor who thought the Mississippi River rose in what is now Canada. We know it actually rises at Lake Itasca in northern Minnesota. But that error caused major problems. And there are others littering all over the world. So for border nerds, and I think there are a lot of border nerds in the world, there are 317 international borders on the planet, the oldest being between Andorra and France, which was set in, I think, 1217. But there's heaps and heaps of detail about that sort of thing. And as much as you could throw a stick at, writing about Dutchess County, New York. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I want to step back for a minute into Wassaic. I loved reading about your first foray into land ownership in Wassaic and your neighbor Rex Brazier, who's in his wonderful artistry of birds. I actually have one of Rex's prints and knew his niece, Melody, actually. Anyway, I think it would be great if you could talk about why you decided to buy your land in Wassaic and what you learned about it, and how you've seen it change over the years.
I lived in Hong Kong from 1985 to 1997. And when Hong Kong passed, as rightly it should, out of British colonial hands back into the hands of the Chinese, and I was a journalist then, and the story, as it were, which was what would happen after the handover, and basically nothing happened for a while. It's happening in spades now, of course, but back then not much was going on. So I decided I would leave Hong Kong. I'd been there for 13 years, and there was should I go to England? Should I go to the United States? Obviously, I'm a British citizen, but I was not a citizen of the United States back then. And a friend of mine who was the New York Times bureau chief in Hong Kong said, "You love America," which I did. I'd been a correspondent here for many years in the 70s and again in the early 80s. Come to a part of America that looks uncannily like Britain, in other words, New England. So he had a house, or his parents had a house in Cornwall Bridge. And so the two of us flew over to New York and went up to Cornwall Bridge, which I instantly adored. The countryside, the hills and the stone walls, and it looked like rural Yorkshire, I suppose. And I fell in love with it. And we went, sort of headquartered ourselves in Kent, Connecticut, and got in touch with a local realtor and crossed over into New York State with the boundary stone, one presumably not erroneously placed. And there was a left-hand turn immediately afterwards, and we came across this sweet little house, which my budget could just about manage. And so I bought it, and I used that as a house for the next several years. But then a plumber from the Bronx who came up and hunted in the land round my house said, why didn't I buy the land to prevent anyone else being a neighbor? Because he knew I was a writer and didn't much like, a very misanthropic sort of person, didn't like neighbors. So yes, I said I'd buy the land for not very much money, it has to be said. And then ultimately I sold the house and moved up to here where I am now in the Berkshires, because the land, though beautiful in Wassaic, was on the north slope of a mountain and not very good for anything other than preservation, as you two obviously know only too well. You can't turn it into a thriving dairy farm or anything like that. So I thought I'd buy more horizontal land. But I was so in love with this near vertical land in Dutchess County that I bought it and have kept it ever since, and have done nothing with it, except there is, as you possibly know, a little the Carey Institute in Millbrook have put a little monitor on it to detect, it's a NASA project, I think, to detect the retention of water in the leaves of trees. And every so often a satellite flies over and this thing beams up signals, and they come with students every so often. So I think the land is to some extent useful to someone. To me, it's just peace and quiet, where I can indulge in this forest bathing, as it's rather fashionably called today. And I think I've also given a few acres to you guys, haven't I?
Mm-hmm.
Leave you, and you occasionally send me letters saying you're going to fly over it and survey it or something.
Which we
anyway, I love it. I love it, but I have made no use of it other than merely to love it.
That's okay.
Yes. But it goes to the point of, it was when I was there, I think one night walking on it, I began to think, what does it actually mean? A few years later, I became a citizen of this country in a big ceremony on the USS Constitution in Boston Harbor, and was enormously proud of now joining this country. And a day or so after the ceremony, I came down to the land in Dutchess County and was walking around it and thought, I now own a piece of the United States. I'm now invested, literally invested in this country. But then I thought, what does it mean? And then started looking into the antecedents, the Mohicans that lived there. They never thought they owned it. And as far as I know, no Native American tribe anywhere in the United States has ever really seriously believed that they owned the land any more than you could own the air or own the ocean. So this whole concept of what ownership means was born on a contemplative evening walking in Wassaic.
That's so interesting. One of the things that you mentioned a couple of times in your book is the bundle of rights that comes with land ownership. And I think it's kind of interesting how, we always talk about the balance of rights and responsibilities. And so when you buy land, you have this bundle of rights that comes with it. But what about the responsibilities? Is that, we work with so many landowners who want to learn how to be good stewards of their land. And I think it's really interesting that these rights are kind of codified, but the responsibilities are kind of left to everyone's own judgment. Can you talk a little bit about the origin of that bundle of rights and how it differs from culture to culture?
Well, it completely, the bundle of rights includes things like the ability, the right to harvest the timber and get the minerals and so forth, but also, and crucially, the right to exclude other people from it. You can put up notices saying no trespassing or no entry or whatever, varies from state to state and country to country. And to me, this whole concept of the right that people have to access the land is central to at least my appreciation of the land. The two polar opposites are represented by, if you like, Sweden and the United States. And I can even refine that further, Sweden and Texas. Because in Texas, they essentially have a right that if you go uninvited onto someone's land, they can shoot you. They can't actually kill you, but they can hurt you. And they wouldn't, in most counties in Texas, get very severely punished by the courts for so doing. In Sweden, however, and this equally applies, although in a slightly watered down fashion, in Norway and Finland and Denmark, this concept of allemansrätten, all men's right to wander the land. You can go anywhere. You can't go into someone's kitchen and demand a cup of coffee. You can't actually go into their garden and trample over their roses, but you can go wherever you like beyond the little pale of fencing that they might have. You could certainly walk over my land in Duchess County. You could have an absolute right because the land effectively, or access to it, belongs to everyone. And this right it's ancient and fully respected, but there is a code of conduct. It varies from country to country. In Sweden particularly, as long as you respect the privacy of anyone that lives on the land, then you can do anything you like. You can sleep on it, you can camp on it, you can walk on it. You probably wouldn't ride a noisy motorcycle next to someone's house. You learn how to respect one another, and that I think is admirable. The code has extended recently to Scotland, and ever since Scotland gained a measure of semi-independence from England about 10, 12 years ago, so the laws relating to land and access to it have changed significantly. And I spent a lot of time when I was researching this book with a man who lives in Helmsdale in the far, far north of Scotland, where some of the tragedies of the clearances occurred in the 19th century, and it's full of ruined crofts, and the people that lived in them, deemed to be less profitable than sheep, came over to Canada and the particular part of Scotland. They went and founded Winnipeg in Manitoba, oddly enough, coincidentally, considering what we were talking about a few minutes ago. But the important thing about this friend of mine, who's called Michael Wigan, he has 22,000 acres, which is a lot of acreage. And he shepherds it, quite literally. He raises sheep on it, cattle, forestry. He has a stream, the Helmsdale River, which is very important for salmon fishing. And so he makes a relatively decent living. It used to be the case 10 years ago that he could, in theory, forbid anyone from going on it. In other words, he could exercise one of the rights of his bundle of rights. But the law has now changed, and people are absolutely at liberty to wander over any of his acres so long as they behave properly. Does he care? He says no. He said, I'm so happy. I love sharing my land with people, providing they behave themselves. If only that would come to this country. That's what I'd love to see. My land is not that attractive that anyone would want to wander on it. But as far as I'm concerned, they can. And these awful orange notices banning people from it, to me, is repugnant.
I also love the idea of, being able to access land or people sharing their land with others. I was also intrigued by your discussion in the book about the community buyouts in Scotland and how private land is then reverted back to more of a community ownership. Can you talk a little bit about that?
To me, it's fascinating. I mean, I used to live on an island in Scotland, the Isle of Ling, not very well known. It's near Oban, near Mull, near Scarborough. But there was an island off Mull called Ulva, U-L-V-A, which was small. It was about 5,000 acres, had a tiny, tiny population. And it was owned by a family called Howard. And I knew the last owner, a chap called Jamie Howard, who's terribly nice. There were a number of personal tragedies in his life. And he decided about 5 years ago to sell the island. And he put an advertisement in the Scottish Field, which is the glossy magazine, which has a lot of what one might call real estate porn. You read this thing and you think, God, I'd love that place. No, I'd love that place. And he put the island on sale for £4 million, let's say £4 million. I think that was the asking price. And he got about 5 people, 3 of them Americans, 2 of them from Russia, who said, yes, this would be lovely. £4 million is chicken feed to us. We'd love to have a Scottish island. And they came in their helicopters. And he was within an ace of doing a deal when Nicola Sturgeon, who's the head of the Scottish government, made a speech to her followers in Scotland, the Scottish Assembly, saying, we are reforming everything to do with the sale and purchase of land in Scotland because too much of it is owned by too few people. There used to be a theatre company called the 784 Theatre Company in Scotland, satirizing the fact that 7% of the population own 84% of the land. Nicola Sturgeon and her crew, quite legitimately in my view, wanted to reverse that and make everyone, or many, many more people, own land. And she used the sale of Ulva as a test case. And she told her followers at the conference that the law was being applied. First of all, the law had been changed, and now it was being applied as a test case to the potential sale for £4 million of the Isle of Ulva. We're not going to allow this sale to go ahead. Ulva can only be bought by a community, not by an individual, whether they're American or Russian or whoever. A hastily formed community established itself within a week, 40 people said, this is a good deal. Formed them people, some of them English, who had never been to Scotland before. And they formed themselves into a community and said, right, we are a community now. We'd like to bid for the Isle of Ulva. And the Scottish government said, yes, all right, you can. You're a legitimate community. So they have something called the Scottish Land Fund to encourage this. We'll give you £3.75 million as a grant. All you now have to do is to raise £250,000 more to come up with Mr. Howard's purchase price, and the island's yours. Well, they came up with it almost overnight. And now the Isle of Ulva belongs to 40 people, many of whom have never met each other before. But I know it sounds bizarre, but oddly enough, it's beginning to work. And this has already happened to an island not too far away called Eigg, although it's spelled E-I-G-G. And that was owned by a series of desperados over the years, dreadful people who just neglected the crofters who lived on the island, didn't give them electricity, medical help, schools, anything like that. They just took the rent and made a lot of money. And that was ended on Eigg about 10 years ago. And Eigg now, like Ulva, is owned by the community. All the crofters who live on it own it. And now they've got solar power, now they've got schools, now they've got all the trappings of relative prosperity that you have on mainland Scotland. And to me, it seems to be a very good, sensible development. And I welcome it. Jamie Howard, he took his £4 million. He now lives in the south of France. He doesn't care too much.
That's a great story.
It is. Simon, one of the things I was excited to see in your book was when you talk about the concept of wilding, and you give some examples like the demilitarized zone in Korea. And you mentioned Isabella Tree's book, Wild, which I have actually just recently read. And I'm just so fascinated by this concept because a lot of times, we have landowners who are very interested in learning how to steward their land. And the idea of, well, can't I just let nature take its course always seems to be a good idea. But, here in Dutchess County, we have such a problem with invasive species, especially those understory shrubs, that letting nature take its course can actually lead to pretty significant habitat degradation. So I'm just wondering what you can think of in terms of examples you've seen around the world, and how does a landowner find a good balance between those?
Well, it's a very, very tricky question, as you've summarized yourself. I mean, the first, as it were, managed wilding took place in something I write about for another reason earlier in the book, in eastern Holland, in a part of Holland called Flevoland, where they set aside, the authorities who dredged up Flevoland from the sea, they set aside several thousand acres to wild it, to, in other words, allow nature effectively to take its course, but introduced animals that were archaic and hadn't been seen in Europe for a long time, and saw how they got on. And it was a disaster because they didn't do it properly, and the animals started starving, and people that were in the railway trains seeing dying horses and dying pigs and so forth got really upset. And a few people got out of the trains and started throwing bundles of hay over the barbed wire fences, and the authorities realized they had miscalculated, and so they abandoned the effort. Much more sensibly, this couple, Charlie Burrell and Isabella Tree, Isabella having written this book on wilding, they were extremely wealthy people who lived in a castle about 40 miles south of London called Knepp Castle, sort of Downton Abbey kind of place. And they had 3,000 acres, so modest, which they ran as an arable farm, a dairy farm as well. And it didn't make enough money. And then they had this idea, which of course Isabella talks about in the book, of allowing it to be sensibly, and they would allow wilding in a curated sense. They would look after it to make sure that invasive species weren't coming, but otherwise let it get on with itself. And they introduced animals that hadn't been seen in Britain for many years, and slowly birds that were normally threatened by modern agriculture and killed by pesticides and so forth started returning. And it became what it is today, which is a singular demonstration of artificial encouraged wilding. And so now they have shrewdly capitalized on this, and they have glamping sites, and people can come and see these remarkable animals and see what Britain looked like 1,000 years ago, if you like. Well, other landowners who have perhaps longer experience, or, well, there's a lot of skepticism, put it that way. And one of my chums in England, who actually owns a part of Vermont as well, said, and despite your very sensible objections about invasive species, says, look, in this part of the world, in New England, this used to be farmed intensely, much more so in New York State than here in Massachusetts, at least until more recently in New York State. Most of the farmers here in Berkshire County left years ago and either went to more congenial parts of the country climatically or down to New York City. The little bit of land that I own here, and I've got 75 acres in Berkshire County, is riddled with walls that were put up 150 years ago. There were fields, you find old agricultural equipment and so forth, iron rims of wheels of carts and so forth. Then it was abandoned. And what has happened? Yes, we do have pockets of invasive species, but also we've got wild animals, we've got moose, we've got deer. I mean, of course, people are generally not very pleased to see deer. We've got bobcats, we've got all manner of owls, all manner of... It's been naturally wilded. Nature is taking its own course. And with the taking away the problem of invasive species, we're relatively lucky. I mean, yes, I've got this horrible thorny stuff, which is all over the woods in certain patches, and I cut it back as much as I can. But I think I prefer sort of spiritually, intellectually, if I didn't mean to sound too pretentious about this, natural rewilding than artificial rewilding. So in the great scheme of things, on the other hand, what do I know? In the great scheme of things, I'm against what Isabella Tree is doing and much in favor of what's happening naturally in places like Berkshire County, Massachusetts. She'll probably never speak to me again now.
So Simon, I want to step back a little bit. In your book, there are many examples of people being forcibly removed from their lands. Can you talk about the different ways that this painful legacy has been dealt with around the world?
Well, the obvious and most painful of all, of course, is what happened to the Native Americans. And particularly I'm interested in, the name says it all, the 5 civilized tribes. I mean, this is a term used with astonishing condescension by white people for the 5 tribes, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Comanche, and the Seminole, who lived in the southeast of the United States. They lived in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida. And this was land that was very much wanted by white settlers. And so under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, who is on the $20 bill, I think, who was sympathetic to the idea of Indian removal, these people were terrorized and persuaded to leave their extremely well-run farms and to abandon their fairly well-organized villages, and they had sophisticated systems of government and so forth, and were forced over the Mississippi to live in the lands that make up present-day Oklahoma. Now, all sorts of similar things, perhaps not quite so tragic, less violence, more persuasion, was used. For instance, the Mohican that lived in this part of the world are now in Wisconsin, near Green Bay, Wisconsin. And occasionally they come back here and quite reasonably keen over the lands that were once their hunting and gathering and traditional homes. So it's, to my way of thinking, completely monstrous. I get the vague feeling, though, I don't know, I'd be interested to hear what you say. I'm, for my sins, moderator of the little town that I live in here in Berkshire County. And at every town meeting, I say a Pledge of Allegiance and then follow it by, don't sit down, everybody. Stand for a moment in silent respect for the Native Americans who used to live on the lands that we call our own today. And most people think, oh, for God's sake, how woke can you get? And this is inappropriate. But I'm merely following the model of what is done now at every public meeting in both Australia and New Zealand, where apologies are given and respect is offered to, in the one case, the Maoris, and in the other case, to the Aboriginals. And I think this is something that should happen in the United States. We should remember that essentially, and this goes back to the question of ownership, we are guests in their land. The land, they say, and Chief Sealth, who famously sold his land for the building of the city of Seattle, said you can no more own land than you can own the ocean or you can own the air. But do remember, if you choose to own it, that the earth is your mother. Respect the earth, love the earth. You don't own it, it owns you. And all these kind of homilies I entirely agree with, and I dare say you do too.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, Julie, the other thing that, resonated with me is how much we could have learned from the natives, such as in Australia, the forest fires, and actually even America, the forest fires, and how maybe we could have done a better job of controlling them if we had listened.
Yes, I mean, I don't mean to interrupt, but I mean, this whole business of what they call cool fires, which you see Aboriginal people who live in wooded areas that are theoretically very prone to fire because gum tree exists in an extraordinarily hot environment. And if the underbrush is not controlled and beaten down, a lightning strike or anything can set off a fire, which would be all-consuming. And the Aboriginals have long practiced this idea of taking a lighted piece of gum bark or something and brushing it onto the underbrush and stamping out the fire that then exists, that then flares up for 20 minutes or so, never allowing it to flare out of control, but thereby keeping the underbrush to a minimum and hugely minimizing the prospect of the kind of massive forest fires that have been seen in Australia in the last 2 austral summers. We can learn a lot. Well, as you rightly mentioned a few moments ago, we can learn an awful lot from the practices of Aboriginals, First Nation people, Native Americans, and Maori. But do we? No, we disdain them and treat them badly.
And that's something I think you covered really well in your book. You know, I think what we learn in our schools doesn't really cover the true history. You know, we learn that there were a few people that were seen as ignorant savages, and then there weren't very many. But what you make very clear is that there was a civilization here. The Americas hosted millions of people. It was a true advanced, sophisticated civilization. And these were people who were conscious and careful stewards of their land. And you know, one of the things that I've read a lot more about recently is a great upsurgence in interest in that native knowledge, certainly much of which has been lost over time, but it even has an acronym, so it's a real thing. It's TEK, which is traditional ecological knowledge. And it's very much what you're talking about, the practices of, you know, fire control and farming and land management that were intrinsic to these cultures that have been lost, but not entirely. And you point out some of those instances where we do have a lot to learn, and I hope we can always learn more.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. One of the places I went, not for research on this book, but when I was going, I think, to Oklahoma to do some research, which was germane to the book, I passed through St. Louis. And east of St. Louis, they have these enormous mounds, the residue, the relics of a people called, well, the place is called Cahokia.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just blown away. This was a sophisticated civilization, as sophisticated as any of the civilizations we know much better about in Guatemala and Mexico City and so on and so forth. This existed outside St. Louis, and there are these huge, rising out of a totally flat floodplain of the Mississippi, these mounds, which now they've x-rayed them, are full of structures and display architectural beauty of people who mysteriously disappeared. But nonetheless, you ask the average person in this country, what do you know about Cahokia? And they would say, I've never heard of it. Well, we have now an Interior Secretary, Deb Haaland, presumably starts work today from the Southwest Pueblo Indians. Maybe she'll breathe some life into our appreciation of the Native Americans. I'm too old and not competent enough, and not American really, to write a book about them, but I would love to. For me, the definitive work is Angie DeBoe's classic work on the Natives Americans of the United States. And I think it should be required reading in all schools. We need to know. Interestingly, a school not too far from where all of us live, the Hotchkiss School in Lakeville, Connecticut, was indeed financed by the family that made the Hotchkiss machine gun. The Hotchkiss machine gun was first used in anger at the massacre at Wounded Knee, where 200 and odd Sioux were mown down by these weapons. And in 1899 or 1897, I think it was. And when I gave a talk there about something completely unrelated a few years ago, I suggested that all, on the anniversary of that shooting, all children should wear a black armband, and there should be a scholarship offered to a Sioux who could come, something of an apology. But none of the children at the school had any idea about the Battle of Wounded Knee and the origins of the name of their school. So it's a subject which is undertaught in this country and needs to be better known.
Absolutely. So I'm going to turn to, you write about enclosure and clearance as tragedies of improvement. Can you talk about what you mean?
Yes, I mean, this goes to the very heart of the matter. Up to about the 15th century in Britain, land was owned commonly. There was common land. I mean, the word still exists, the common. You have a village, a gathering of houses, and the land that the houses surrounded was used by everyone. So a chap that had cattle would graze his cattle, a person that had pigs, a person that grew turnips, a person that grew wheat. All the land was held in common. And that was seen to be fair and reasonable, and everyone loved the idea. Until 15th or early 16th century, when some people, realizing the increasing need for food supplies, that farming should be more efficient. And the common wasn't actually very efficient because the cattle would eat the corn and the pigs would eat the turnips. So why not segment the land and build fences between bits, and individuals could own land. So one individual could own a field in which you grew wheat, and another individual could own a field in which you would have pigs. And so the idea of clearance, ending the commonly held land and bringing forth the idea of privately held land was born. And it became in 1604 codified in Parliament, and laws were passed. First one in a village very close to where I grew up in Dorset, a village called Radipole, where the Parliament said the common land in Radipole is going to be subjected to, we'll put up fences and we'll render it private. And so notices were tacked up on the local church door saying that this is going to happen. And if there are any objections, you can object. And if not, then the common land will become privately owned. As a result of that, a number of people, farming certainly became more efficient, and the food supply to the nation became more abundant. And some people became very rich. But a lot of people were very angry and dispossessed. They no longer had access to land that was hitherto commonly owned. And they went either to the cities, or they began to emigrate to the New World or to Australia or to New Zealand. So this idea was essentially, began in England, but it spread all over the world, and it led to the idea of private ownership of land. And the thing about the private ownership of land and why it is so hugely important in a society like this, and this isn't talking about trespass or the bundle of rights or anything, is that because land is, or used to be, thought of as being absolutely permanent, it would never go away, never fly away, they're not making any more of it, as the cliche has it, then once you own it, you can go to the bank and say to your bank manager, so I own 100 acres of land, I'll put that up as security, and I'll borrow money from you to buy a tractor or to buy a refrigerator or a motor car. It's the basis of capitalism. So enclosure, beginning in England in the 16th century, led to the use of land as the basis for capitalism. You also mentioned clearance. Clearance is rather different, and it's a very tragic thing, and it's largely practiced in Scotland, and particularly by a villain called the Duke of Sutherland, way up in northern Scotland, who has one of the biggest statues of any person in the world outside the Soviet Union anyway, on a huge plinth on top of a hill. You can see it from dozens of miles away. It looks like a huge radio mast. And it's offensive anyway, but it's particularly offensive to Scots because this man was English, and they hate the English, as you well know. But this man, what he did, the Duke of Sutherland, he looked at his vast estates, and it was the biggest estate in Europe at the time, beginning of the 19th century. he said, why do I just derive my income from rents paid to me by tenant farmers, crofters as they're called? Sheep are much more profitable. I'll turf them all out. I'll burn them out. I'll drive them out with soldiers. And I'll replace them with sheep. And so in the case of the Duke of Sutherland and the crofters who live near the man I was talking about earlier, Michael Wigan, is that he said, I'm a compassionate man. You're useless to me sitting out in the countryside, but I'll build you a little village in a town I own on the seaside, and you can all be fishermen. And they say, we've never fished in our lives, never been to the sea, we've no idea. Oh, you'll manage. But of course they didn't manage, they were useless. And they essentially, cutting a long story short, saw a passing ship, said, stop. And the ship was going to supply the Hudson Bay Company in northern Canada. And they all piled onto the ship, had a dreadful crossing, but arrived in about 1820 in near Churchill, Manitoba, and walked through the winter time to the Red River Valley and established the city of Winnipeg. And including one of them, one of the people that was thrown out of his croft, got on the ship, endured the crossing, was the father of the second Prime Minister of Canada, John Diefenbaker. So it all ended nicely in the end, but nonetheless, it's a story of misery and tragedy, mostly affecting the Scots.
So Julie, it's nice to see you back.
I'm not sure what happened. I didn't touch anything.
It was rather strange. You were replaced by a Wi-Fi aerial.
So Simon, you talked about, land being permanent, but as we're seeing now, especially with, climate change, that maybe land isn't really permanent. We see it disappearing. And you talked about that, but you also talked about building land. And, we've seen both. And, maybe not as much building land now as some of the examples that you provided, but, there's kind of it was interesting to see the contrast between losing and building land.
Yes, I mean, I was particularly fascinated, and I had a bit of a tussle with my editor, who wasn't as fascinated as I was. But I won that battle. I lost one of the But
I'm glad.
What?
I said, I'm glad. It was great to read.
I thought it was fascinating. It's the construction of this part of Holland that we mentioned earlier, called Flevoland. Basically, Holland is, as you may well know, it has a huge interior sea, or it used to, called the Zuiderzee, the Southern Sea. And the waters from the North Sea, one of the most turbulent pieces of sea in the world, would regularly rush in and cause all sorts of devastation. And it was decided in the 1890s, but put into effect in the 1920s, to build a huge barrier across the north of Holland and shut off the Zuiderzee and turn it into a lake. And the building of that barrier took many years, very, very technically difficult. So once it's a lake, then it eventually ceases to be salt because it evaporates and the rain fills it up and it becomes fresh water. Then they had the thought of creating what are called polders, which are these huge tracts of land raised from the sea. And unlike all other land in the world, has never belonged to anyone else before or been the hunting grounds of anyone else before. So Flevoland is the particular polder I was interested in. They began work on it in the late 1950s. They delineated about 1 million acres of sea, and they built cofferdams around it and put huge pumps which pumped out the water day and night for years until eventually you saw mud and slush, and it eventually became drier and drier and drier. You couldn't walk on it, you'd sink into this mud. But then they would fly aircraft over it with reed seeds, and you would produce in the next growing season a huge forest of reeds, which they then set fire to, and it would become ash, and then they do it again. So more ash, more reeds, more ash. And then they'd put grass seeds, thousands, tens of thousands of tons. And eventually, by doing this year after year after year, it took about 30 years, you would produce soil, and it was sufficiently strong that you could walk on it, and then build paths on it, and then drive tractors onto it, and build roads, and lay out towns, schools, farms, and so forth. And that's what they did. And finally, they opened it to the public, as it were. And being the Dutch and eminently practical, sensible people, pragmatic, they said, okay, how do we apportion this land, which has never belonged to anyone? We'll divide it into 60-acre plots, and we'll advertise that it's available to rent for a peppercorn rent, virtually nothing, to anyone that's interested. And if they improve it in a very sort of Lockean, Jeffersonian way, if you do something with the land and make it, give of its abundance, potential abundance, then you can own it and you can pay us, the government, for it. But so they put advertisements in the newspapers saying, hundreds and hundreds of 60-acre plots, newly made, born from the sea. And you can rent it if you like, but we're going to apportion it exactly as the demographic makeup of Holland. So from your applications, the successful ones will be 30% will be Catholic, 30% will be Protestant, 30% will be members of the Dutch Reformed Church, and 10% other. And it's worked stupendously well. So you've got a little microcosm of Holland with a little capital city called Lelystad after Cornelis Lely, who was the man that built the Great Barrier in the first place. And the place is boring beyond belief, but full of very contented Dutch people. 30% Catholic, 30% Protestant, 30% Reform, and 10% other.
That's incredible. I don't think they'd allow that in the United States nowadays.
No, well, I'm not sure that we've got a lot to learn from the Dutch one way and another, but that's a completely different story.
Well, I always find that every bit of land has a story to tell. And I think that's something that you talk a lot about in your book, and the story of from geologic history to the formation of soils and growing of plants. And every bit of land does have a story to tell if you look and listen and pay attention and learn.
Well, you're absolutely right. I used to be a geologist. That's what my degree was in. And geology, I don't need to state the obvious, but geology is history. It's just history with a rather longer time scale than human history. But it seemed to me quite logical to begin the story, once we'd dealt with the details of the purchase, to look at, okay, Wassaic, tell me the story of land that, of course, initially was not land at all. It wasn't where it is today. It was somewhere down near where the South Pole is today. And things happened that eventually created what is now the land, and then it was populated by plants, and then eventually by beasts, and then eventually by people. And then came Henry Hudson sailing up in 1609 up the river that now bears his name, and doing deals with the people he met along the way, and venturing, his men and his successors, and venturing out into the woods and making charcoal and making iron and turning into what I now, quote, own, but am troubled about the nature of owning, and happily giving some of it to you guys. That's what I'm hoping anyway, because I think you guys and land trusts and conservancies are such a brilliant idea.
So talking about that, you mentioned the Trustees of Reservations in your book, which is the oldest nonprofit land conservation organization in this country. They're an amazing organization, and one that younger groups like us that are only 36 years old certainly look up to. So knowing so much about land and something about our types of organizations, what do you think? Do you have any ideas, or what are the benefits of organizations like ours? And do you have any thoughts for us?
Well, I don't know the thoughts that you haven't had yourselves, other than what you're doing is absolutely admirable. The next, and Sandersfield, where I live now, has no such community land trust. I think it should have, but as moderator, I'm not sure that I have influence. I would be seen to be party free. But the next town, New Marlborough, and beyond that, Monterey on the way to Great Barrington, they have pretty active land trusts now, and they cajole and persuade and sort of make some people that own a lot of land quite reasonably feel that it is their civic duty to hand over the management and some degree of title to the land to the local land trust. And certainly this movement seems to be growing in energy, particularly in the northeast of the United States, but not exclusively. It's in Oregon, in California to an extent, in Georgia, in Alabama. So the old idea of community land ownership seems to be reviving itself, and I think that's absolutely admirable. It flies so much in the face of what I deplore. Sounds very pompous for me to say it that way, but I think I do deplore it, which are these people that seek to own vast amounts of land just for the hell of the delight, if you like, of owning it. And we know the biggest landowners in this country, private landowners, are Ted Turner and John Malone. Malone owning a lot of the Northeast, particularly in Maine. Biggest in the world is an Australian woman called Gina Reinhardt, who owns 29 million acres, some of it bought from the Kidman cattle station, the Kidmans of Nicole Kidman. She comes from a very wealthy family. But the people that I have reserved most venom for are a couple of young men who live in West Texas. They're called the Wilkes brothers, who made a great deal of money in making the propellants, as it were, for fracking, which seems to be a very unseemly industry anyway, and made so much money that their company became a target of a buyout by the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund, which bought it 8 years ago for $4 billion. So these two young men, who are members of a very curious right-wing evangelical organization, the kind you sort of only find in West Texas, now had $2 billion each. And they've been going on a shopping spree for land all over Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, and crucially, disallowing people who have hitherto snowmobiled or walked or hiked or whatever of going on it. They're just keeping it for themselves and excluding people from it. And that seems to me to be quite monstrous. So in the spectrum of the management of land, organizations like Duchess Land Conservancy and the New Marlborough Village Association Land Cooperative, totally good. The Wilkes brothers, execrably bad.
So I'm not sure what, so about time, it's about 8:05, and I don't know if we're doing extra time because we started late or if we should.
I think so, yes. So why don't do you have more questions that you'd like to discuss with Simon?
I have one anyway.
Okay, we've got a couple more and then we can go to questions.
So Simon, I am one of those people who loves maps. Like I could spend hours and hours poring over a USGS map. And I know you had a little bit of experience making a map for a college project in Scotland. And I find the history of cartography fascinating. And so can you talk about your own experience and as well as the evolution and science of map making?
Well, I adore everything. I wish you could see my study. I have so many atlases here and a great map cabinet with all sorts of maps. No, I love them, and I cherish particularly the English, what's called the Ordnance Survey, which produces 201 sheets of the country. Used to be at the scale of 1 to a million, 1 to 63360, which not 1 to a million, I'm sorry, 1 inch to the mile. So in my, I think, second year at Oxford, one of the things for geology undergraduate, 6 square miles of somewhere in the United Kingdom. And the southern end of an island called Rasay, which is between Skye and the Scottish mainland, is exceptionally blessed with all sorts of interesting geology. There's a basalt mountain called Dun Carn, on which Samuel Johnson danced a jig, if you read your Boswell. And there's Cretaceous, there are ironstones which were mined by German prisoners of war, and it's fascinating. So I said to my lecturer. And I do Rasay, and a long, long way from Oxford, but off I went, and lived there for a month or so in a roofless croft, one of the crofts that had fallen victim to the clearances in the 19th century, and in my sleeping bag, and cooking over a primus, what's called a primus stove, and living in extremely primitive conditions for the month. It enabled me ultimately to produce a map, which I still have, which is relatively primitive, nonetheless, got all the geology right. One of the problems was that most of the Hebrides, the old timers, are very, very devout. And if I was out with my hammer and my clinometer and my little bottle of hydrochloric acid and my magnifying glass on the Sabbath, they would say, Mr. Winchester, shouldn't be out on the Sabbath. It's the Lord's day of rest. You're not to be hammering those rocks. So I got into I think that was a lot of maps. And then got the
Simon, I think we've lost you. You are coming in and out. And we've lost visuals, and you're popping in and out on the video there. So while you are trying to get
what to do.
back, do you want to find out, Simon, maybe back in again? Or refresh your browser, perhaps? There we go. Yep. I apologize, everyone, for these issues. It's tricky when you're relying on Wi-Fi or internet, and we have signal issues, so they can go in and out. While we're waiting for Simon to reconnect, Rebecca, could you tell anybody in the audience who may be interested in supporting Duchess Land Conservancy about some of the programs that you do and how members of the general public can lend their support to the organization?
Sure. So most of our work is with working with landowners who are interested in protecting their land, as Simon noted. So if you are a landowner who would like to learn more about that, it's a pretty easy process, and there are some benefits to landowners who would like to pursue that. We also work directly with municipalities that want to buy land to open as a preserve. So we have a great project that we did in the town of Dover, which is the Dover Stone Church, working with the town of Dover and a friends group. And it's a fabulous place to visit. Anybody would like to go and see it. We also do, we have over 43,000 acres under conservation. And so stewardship is a big part of that. And so we can be seen as a resource in terms of, best management practices on land. So if people have questions, and that's actually something we've just gone through a strategic planning process. And one of the things that we want to sort of build on is our ability to really help landowners understand their land and be able to steward it and care for it. And then Julie actually runs a fabulous education program that we have. And last year, we, like everybody else, had to reinvent our program and go online with a lot of stuff. We were trying to do some stuff in person so we can, because the nice thing about land conservation is a lot of it's outdoors. And so we also do a lot of programs, and those are totally open to the public for the most part. And would love to have people come out and join us. Our website is www.duchessland.org, and we're easy to find, and we're friendly people and always happy to talk to people or answer emails, or I don't know, Julie, if you want to add anything. Oh, there's Simon. I had a little commercial.
Oh, he's gone again.
Oh
dear. Where did he go?
So maybe when he comes back in, you want to just go ahead and open to questions.
I am, and I think we only have a couple of questions. Simon, hello. I think we're going to because we're running a little over now, and while you were gone, Becky was just explaining to the audience a little bit more about what Duchess Land Conservancy does and how people can get involved with the organization and contact them, etc. So we do have a question here from Jeff Hitpold, and he said, what was the name of the book on Native Americans that you said should be required reading?
It is Angie Debo, D-E-B-O, A History of the Indians of the United States. She has written many, many books, but that she, I think, passed on, but she was a professor in Oklahoma for many years, and that is sort of the definitive text.
And I could add a couple more titles to that list. Two of my favorites are 1491, which was written by, I believe it was Charles Mann, M-A-N-N.
Yep, yep.
Existed in North and South America at the time of European contact. So that year, 1491, before Columbus arrived. That was really good. And also I've recently read Native New Yorkers by Evan Pritchard, which is wonderful, especially if you are familiar with New York City, because he really talks about all of the main thoroughfares of the city and their origins as various Indian trails connecting the different tribes and this very local New York City to Lower Hudson history of the tribes that existed in that area. It's very, very thorough.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those resources. And I think as we're running a little over, we've lost a few people. Does anybody else have a question? Anybody in the audience would like to ask a question?
There is one from Becky. You see it in the chat.
Take a look. Oh, we don't have it in the chat. It's in the questions. Let me just open up the chat. That's a. There we go. Okay, Becky says, hello, I just wanted to say as a young geologist who grew up in Dutchess County, I'm excited to finish reading your new book. My question is, what advice would you give to someone who wants to communicate complicated topics like geology to the public? I recently started making educational geology videos, and I find it difficult sometimes to be precise and engaging at the same time. Thank you for your time with us tonight.
Well, gosh, I've written now 3 books on geology. The Map That Changed the World, which was about William Smith and the creation of the first ever geological map of anywhere. Krakatoa, which was about the eruption of the volcano in 1883, August 27th in Indonesia. And The Crack in the Edge of the World, which was about the San Francisco earthquake in 1906, April the 18th. All of those books were essentially geology books, but with a human face. And so there's quite a relatively detailed discussion of the nature of volcanoes or the nature of stratigraphy when it comes to the making of the map, or the nature of plate tectonics. And to me, making it readable, making it accessible, to use that word, is tricky. But I think what I do, it may sound rather odd, which is that when I've read a passage, when I've written a passage that sounds potentially technical, I stand up and read it because I know I'm going to have to read the audio of the book because I narrate the audio versions. I stand up and read it out loud. On those occasions where I find it so boring that I almost fall asleep listening to myself, I know I haven't got it quite right. So I hone it until it keeps me awake. But it's a challenge, and I don't think. I mean, I'm so thrilled. I can see your note here in text. So geology needs to be better known. It's one of those subjects like Native Americans, which I yearn people to know about. So please, young Dutchess County geologist, stick to your guns and write and write and write and make people interested in what is, to me, uber history. By that, I don't mean the history of the car company. I mean the history we all should know. Geology is everything. It's the basic science we should all know.
I would agree with that. We have a question from Alana.
Can I just follow up on that quickly?
Yeah,
And say, Becky, give me a call. I'll be in the office on Friday because we do educational videos. That's something we've had to learn how to do because of everything being remote. And geology is a subject that I would very much like to communicate better to our people who are interested in stewardship. So give me a call.
That's wonderful. We're a job service too. Alana Whitman says, we've so enjoyed this event tonight. Thank you. We'd like to know what you're working on next, Simon.
Yes, I am doing a book, which I'm hoping to deliver at the end of 2022, called, the working title anyway, is Knowing What We Know. The history of the dissemination of knowledge and the threat to the future of wisdom. The idea being that because knowledge is so accessible now on tap through Google and Wikipedia, that we're in danger of not keeping it in our noggins. And wisdom, I've always thought, was multiply knowledge by experience, and you get occasionally people who are wise. But if knowledge is disdained and devalued, as I think it is being these days, then there'll be no wise people. So it's a history of teaching. What do people know? What should they know? History of encyclopedias, history of newspapers. It's a big topic.
It's a very big topic. Thank you. And then Dick Hermans, who says hello to everybody. Dick is the owner of Oblong Books. He says, Simon, what was the most exotic place you visited researching this book?
Well, the exotic, that's one of those loaded words. I mean, I love New Zealand, but I think the place that I developed most affection for was the Ukraine. I went there to write about a tragedy, which was the appalling genocide in the early 1930s, the millions who died of enforced starvation after the edicts of Stalin in the early 1930s. But Ukraine, I love, and I've always liked that part of the borderland between Europe and Asia. And so I had a very good time, and my gosh, you can see why Stalin regarded it as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, because things grow there on this rich black earth, the Chernosem, or whatever it's called. And the earth looks so rich, you could eat it without the inconvenience of passing vegetables through it. You just want to stuff it in your mouth. It's so good. But that I liked. Whether it's exotic, I'm not sure, but it sure is fascinating.
Well, and I think that was our last question. Do we have any last questions? Anybody? I don't think so. Well, I would like to thank you all so much for a lovely discussion. I know we had our technical glitches this evening, but we'll roll with those. There's not much else we can do, is there? We have signed copies of Land available at Oblong Books. You can order them online, or our stores are open. We're observing all COVID protocols. You can order them and pick them up curbside. I'd like to thank HarperCollins for working with us to arrange Simon's appearance this evening. I wish you all good things with the book, Simon. I know it only came out yesterday, so you must be on a tour week this week. And
what a day to begin with the new president.
Yes, the portent. Yes.
When they planned the launch, I don't think they knew how portentous this day was going to be. But anyway, let's not get into politics.
Well, it's a happy day anyway. Well,
very happy.
It is a very happy day. Rebecca and Julie, thank you so much for participating in this. Your expertise was invaluable, and you lent, a particular insight into the topics that are covered in the book. Thank our audience for coming, and please check out our website, oblongbooks.com. We have other events coming up tomorrow. We have Amber Ruffin and Lacey Lamar with their new book, and many other events through the end of February and on into the rest of the year. So I'd like to wish everybody a very good night, and thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great to
Good
talk.
night.